Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. I'm very glad to have with us today Ilana Redstone. Ilana is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champagne. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the questions I usually ask people to come on Free Kiwis, especially academics, is how did you get into this mess? In other words, how did you get into this sort of heterodoxy space in academia?
It's a good question. So I would say I've been kind of working in this space for about, I don't know, maybe 12 years or so. But I have always been interested in kind of moral and ethical complexity. It's just been interesting to me. Um, and why did so I originally did more traditional academic work, but I was just observing around 2014, I guess it was. I actually started observing things in my own department about sort of conflicts that were coming up in my department, that were connected to the broader political conversation. That was sort of what first got me interested. In fact, in my own department, there were a lot of discussions at the time. This is not the case now, but at the time, there were a lot of discussions about whether or it won't. I'm going to say this and it won't necessarily sound connected, but it is actually connected. There were discussions and disagreements about whether or not um, the department wanted to try and improve in the rankings, whether that was a goal or not. And it was very interesting to me how that there was conflict over this. And I didn't, and it, which raises, it raised, got me into all kinds of questions about epistemology and postmodernism and the canon. And that actually was my kind of entry point to sort of putting different pieces together, which led to broader political claims and polarization, et cetera. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so epistemology in the canon, that's slightly surprising to hear from a sociologist. I thought you were going to talk more about sociology as a field, but so questions of the
Well, that's
canon
where I
being
ended
considered
up.
as a
So I've
process.
actually, right, but that's not how, yes, absolutely. Like sociology as a field when it comes to political commitments, I mean, it is almost not completely, but like largely driven by its political and moral commitments now. And even though that is the case, that is not what originally got me kind of into this
Hmm.
space, as odd as that may sound.
Okay,
Although
yeah.
I did just write a paper about sociology and its moral commitments. So that is under review at a journal.
So can you tell me quickly? I mean, I think I can probably guess. I mean, this is the thing. Most people probably have a sense of what the moral commitments are in sociology. Are they,
Yeah.
I mean, thoroughgoing egalitarianism, which I actually happen to share in some ways, but I think that's probably a big one in lots of fields
Mhm.
of academia these days. I think that I get the sense that sociology is one of these fields that could have been very hard in terms of data science and statistics, but it isn't. I don't know if that's a founding commitment. Let me guess just one more. I think
Yeah, go ahead.
nowadays, because I just came from New Zealand academia, I'm gonna sort of go on a limb and say indigeneity or something like that, kind of the rejection of sort of supposed Western ways of thinking. How am I doing?
Yeah, no, you're doing great. You're doing great. Um, so this actually connects to some other work that I've been doing, including the next book. But all of those things that you just said about sort of egalitarianism, about you framed it as indigeneity. Another way to think about it is sort of identity as determined, the salience of identity as determined by your position of structural advantage or disadvantage, or as measured by differences in outcomes. Um, what I would say is that all of those I think are right. Um, First of all, let me just bracket this for a second. I do think that there are some people in sociology who are still very committed to the idea of social science and sort of sort of very analytical. There are there that I would not say. I have no idea what the percentage is of people in the
Yeah,
discipline,
yeah.
but that's certainly not what's driving a lot of the discipline. Okay, so having said that, so the way that I would describe sociology's political and moral commitments is as stemming from the idea that disparate outcomes, that inequality is evidence of discrimination or is evidence of racism or bigotry, because everything else that you said, the focus on identity, the sort of focus on egalitarianism, whatever the other items that you listed, those all actually stem from treating that initial claim as given. So once you treat once you see disparate outcomes or inequality as evidence of or dispositive evidence of discrimination, um, the rest of the sort everything else that comes out of that is sort of there's a like a moral recoding that happens because that is both saying disparities are equal or discrimination is both a moral claim because discrimination is morally loaded, but it's also a causal claim, right? It's also a causal claim about the nature of inequality. And so when we treat that as given, it just treat it as definitive, not a hypothesis, but just treat it as given, all of these other things flow out of it, all of these other moral commitments. And I think that that is largely what has happened. I think that's largely what's happened in sociology. I think that's also what's happened in our broader political conversation. But that's what I would specifically trace it to.
Okay, so you've just written this book called The Certainty Trap. So is one of the
Yeah.
problems with certainty precisely that once you lock into a certain position, there are all these sequelae and consequences that sort of are entailed by that position, and then you end up committing yourself to like a whole world view?
Yeah, I mean that's a great way of putting it. The way what I would say is um I'm the problem that sort of got me interested in this is the problem of the moral condemnation of disagreement. Just sort of the reflexal, disagree with me and you're racist, you're transphobic, you're a bigot, or you're stupid, or you, right? Like you just, that sort
Or
of
you're woke,
what?
or you're woke.
Or yeah, I mean, I guess that would be a different, that's true too. Yes.
Yeah. I'm just trying
I
to
think
balance it out
that's,
there.
no, I think that's fair. I think it has a slightly, I think the two are related and I guess it's worth, I think there's a connection there that's probably worth thinking about. Yes, or you're woke. But so that moral condemnation of disagreement is that's the problem if that I think that I in my own work I'm trying to solve. And so that certainty is what, so how does this tie back to the certainty trap? Certainty is what drives our sense of moral outrage. It drives our sense of righteous indignation. That's more of just an observation than a kind of a normative claim. Like it just, in other words, it's very hard to be morally outraged about something if sorry, let me back up. It's very hard to be morally outraged if there's not some underlying claim that you're treating as certain, right? And so part of it is just part of the solution is just sort of surfacing that understanding and surfacing the assumptions and the claims that we're treating as given. And that's a lot of what the argument that I'm trying to make in the certainty trap.
Okay. Do you talk about religion at all in this book? Because it kind of strikes me that in the past, of course, the people who were kind of burning others at the stake for their views were usually
Yeah,
religious people, certain types of
yeah,
Christianity persecuted other types of Christianity. And in those cases, it's kind of a weird thing because in some senses they're certain that, their view of Christianity was
oh
correct.
yeah,
On the other hand,
yeah.
I sort of think if you were that certain that you were right, why would you need to burn people at the stake, right? Because this is the kind of thing I was trying to say to
Oh, that's so
students
interesting.
when I was in the heterodoxy movement. If you're really secure in your own beliefs, and I've seen Christians do this as well. Well, people can do it
Yeah.
well from all sides of the political compass. You can go into a talk or a debate and just put your view and put what you believe is the best evidence, and you don't have to actually deplatform people or get them fired or burn them at the stake.
And the idea, sorry, just to finish that thought, the idea would be because there's some eternal punishment that's waiting for them anyway.
No, actually, I wasn't going that epic. I was just sort of thinking, and maybe Christianity isn't the best example here, but I mean, just like if you believe that we're in a climate emergency, why do you need to cancel people? Why don't you just have overwhelming evidence, right? And that's why I always got a little bit suspicious when people resort to censorship, that actually maybe they don't have the best evidence for these things, right? And they have to, because if they just had evidence, they would put it there, and people would be, or more people would be convinced if they put the evidence there, right? But obviously they don't
I think
trust
the
in the
argument
strength of
would
their evidence.
be right. No, I mean, I think the argument would be, and I'm not endorsing or condemning it. Wouldn't the argument be something like, okay, but it's this idea, this concept of dangerous ideas that the person who's out there that's a climate denier, yes, okay, the reason I can't ignore them is because the stakes are so high, right? And like that they're putting these, like they are convincing other people to not take this existential problem seriously, and
Yeah,
so therefore we can't get like I think that would be the argument. Um,
that's a good point, though.
yeah,
So,
I
so
mean,
do you think these people, so in those cases, are these extreme sort of deep green people? Do you think
yeah.
they're thoroughly convinced of their own view, Or is it more this idea of like, well, maybe I'm not 100% sure of it, but if we get this wrong, the world is going to like instantly burst into flames. They're going to
It's a
be,
great question.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my guess is it's an interesting question. My guess is it's probably a combination of both. So that there are some people, in other words, and by both I mean there are some people who are completely certain in their convictions. And then there are others who are like, okay, maybe I'm wrong, but the stakes are too high. Like it's my guess is that there's probably some combination of both.
yeah.
I don't have any surveys or anything to back that
But
up.
there are
That's just my
definitely,
intuition.
I mean, you're definitely right that there are people who get to, bigotry is the right word, but they get to this sort of uh, monomaniacal view of things through being certain about a particular view. So what's the source of that? Is that sort of epistemic bubbles where all the information just comes from one side, or what?
Yeah, well, I think that the epistemic bubbles are, I think that's an accelerant. I don't know that it's a cause. I think, yeah. So I think there are lots of things that we tend to look at that are, they tend to get pointed to as causes, and they're actually more of accelerants. So social media, the epistemic bubble, the, media silos, cable news programming, all that stuff. I think all play a role. I don't think of them as causally, um, as causally sort of doing the work, because they, so if you look at sort of the epistemic bubbles or the silos or in, all of those things, they don't, in my view, they can explain why we, or they can help explain why we are so hostile towards one another. They can help explain why we, you know yeah, why we don't trust each other. They can't really explain why that distrust manifested in the particular way that it did. And so to me, they don't provide the causal explanation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. So tell me more about where you think the true causal explanation lies.
So the causal explanation, as I can, this is sort of going into the second book, which is not out yet. Um,
So the second book you just said before we started recording has a possible title of
well, the
Presumptions
title
of
as of
Guilt.
this morning, yeah,
Okay.
presumption of guilt.
This
This is the title as of this morning,
is
but
breaking
I don't
news
know.
on Free Tea Leaves
I
here.
know, breaking news. I know everyone's on the edge
Exclusive.
of their seat.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. This is going to make your career here right now, right here. Yeah. So, but what the book is about, the manuscript is largely done. What the book is about is it traces out how this moral recoding happened. This idea, this moral condemnation of disagreement. This idea that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, and mostly it's the moral condemnation that comes from the left, so that the non-progressive, the conservative views are racist, bigoted, ignorant, etc. And that actually you can trace to a very specific shift, which sort of was centered in the US, I think, as I understand it, but had international implications just because of the way, frankly, because of the way ideas spread. Um, and so this is going back. Is your audience going to be interested? How far back do you want me to go?
No, no,
Do you want me to
definitely. We're
go?
interested in, I mean, I go as far back as the 5th century BC sometimes. So you said,
Oh, okay. So no, so I'm not going that far back. But what I would say is, if you look back to the civil rights movement in this, and I'm talking particularly about the U.S. context at this, but
yeah,
the argument expands more broadly. But in the U.S. context, if you look at the civil rights movement, one of the things that happened around the civil rights movement was that inequality. So after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made discrimination, with its 11 titles, made discrimination illegal across in the private sector across everywhere, right? Where that wasn't the case beforehand. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, anti-discrimination cases could really just be brought under the 14th Amendment, under the Equal Protection Clause. And
so you
so the
had to
Civil
have,
Rights Act,
so does that mean
what?
you had to
And
cross state lines or something like that? I think I
You had to, well, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. Was
Oh,
what was, you're talking about the transportation clause, which is what the Civil Rights Act was brought under, I
oh,
think.
maybe it's that. I think I heard a podcast about this
Right.
ages ago. Yeah.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
is really, I actually just heard someone talking about that, which I thought
Oh,
was
okay.
fascinating. But
Yeah.
that is, the Civil Rights Act was brought under the transformation, not transformation,
Yeah.
transportation
Yeah.
clause.
Yeah.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964. For the 14th Amendment, you had to, it had to be, it had to be a state sponsored, right? Because it's under the Constitution, it had to be, it didn't cover private institutions or private organizations, but you
Okay.
also had to demonstrate intent. So this problem of demonstrating intent to discriminate is really hard, right? Like it's, short of a smoking gun, sort of like a letter or something saying, I don't want to hire women or I don't want to hire minorities or something. It's very hard to prove intent. Usually what ends up happening is intent can be proven by the absence of any plausible explanation, any other plausible explanation, right? But there's almost always some other plausible explanation, except in rare cases. Yick versus Woe was one of the Supreme Court cases that was a rare exception to this. Um, okay, so around the civil rights movement, so anti-discrimination law, so in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, um, part of what happened was in an effort to, I assume, I'm making an assumption about intent here, but in an effort to give sort of more teeth and more power to anti-discrimination law, at the time, there was a court case that determined that disparate outcomes, this was in the early 1970s, in 1971, that disparate outcomes were evidence of just could be evidence of a violation that would constitute a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was the title under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that banned discrimination in employment in the labor market. And so these ideas that disparate outcomes, that unequal outcomes were themselves evidence of racism, these ideas had been around in kind of activist and academic circles for a while. Like this was not,
It sounds
go
like in
ahead.
that context, there really were kind of semi-obvious cases of racism going on. And they brought in this law
I think that's
basically
right.
because it was so hard to prove. But now we've shifted to a position where you just
Well,
almost assume from the get-go
I think that's
that
right. I think, and actually, if you look at the 1971 case, which is Griggs versus Duke Power, like it's very clear. Like it was a unanimously decided case on the Supreme Court. Like it's not a mystery to me how they got there. What I would say is, and again, like I want to be clear, this set of ideas about inequality and racism and sort of racism, the idea of racism without racist intent, those were around in academia and in activist circles for a long time before the Supreme Court case. What the Supreme Court case did was it institutionalized the idea. It said that so under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, discrimination with intent, like I don't want to hire women, was always illegal, right? That was always right. What it did is it said actually discrimination without intent can also be a violation of Title VII. So it legally equated these two
Mhm.
things. And what I think happened is that the moral equation followed almost automatically,
Mhm.
right? Because once the court, so again, the court didn't give birth to these ideas, but the court legally equated them. And once that happened, the moral equation, right? Particularly for the left, for whom this would be sort of naturally something they were more sympathetic to in term from on the political stage, and so that moral equation, which again, like I think was again just what we just said, the legal case was very. It's not a. It was again. It was unanimously decided. Like it's very understandable what the thinking was that led to that case. The moral equation, the moral recoding that followed, once you equate disparities with discrimination, once you treat that not as a hypothesis, but as a statement that these two things are this is this, right? Disparities equal discrimination. That becomes a claim that is treated as given. This is like this is it's certain, the certainty trap, right? It becomes treated as given, so now it's something that you can't question, right?
Mhm.
That changes much more than just how we think about inequality. It changes how we think about everything from the role of intent to the how what power means, the idea of harm,
But
structural advantage, structural disadvantage.
does
It
it also
recodes
mean there's all
everything.
like in certain
Yeah.
situations there are almost no good reasons sort of not to hire someone because they're black, right? I mean, because you might, I mean, there's no good reasons to hire someone when they're black. I mean, sorry. So I actually believe there's no good reasons not to hire someone because they're black. But I mean, like,
Yeah.
there may be situations where you actually are thinking this guy's CV isn't very good, but he happens to be black or happens to be a woman or something. And now, that looks dodgy now, whereas in the past, there were probably some legitimate reasons that they would have accepted right before
Well,
this legal
I
change.
think what it does is it says if you're equating inequality with racism, what it means is that underrepresentation in any field, in whether it's in STEM, whether it's in middle management, upper management, whatever it is, underrepresentation is itself the result of discrimination or racism operating at some level. And so what it means is that this is where you bring in sort of ideas about unconscious bias and right, because if the racism is not living in the hearts and minds of people, it's living sort of in systems, it can be there without people's
Mm,
intention for it to be there, then that suggests we need to re-examine all of our processes for hiring for, right? And so if you are leaning towards not hiring the person who is a member of a group that is structurally under this new thinking, like that is structurally disadvantaged, right? Because based on out and frankly, like if you're using outcomes as a measure, who is a member of a group that is structurally disadvantaged, right? But then the evidence becomes the inequality. The evidence becomes the
yeah,
inequality itself, right? And so the mechanism is less clear, but the evidence is the inequality because the inequality is dispositive proof that there's something immoral going on with respect to racism and discrimination.
right.
Um, again, I want to be clear that what I'm pointing out, it's not a claim that discrimination isn't real or that racism isn't real. What I'm saying is that what creates the certainty trap and the recoding is the assumption that inequality is itself evidence of this moral
Yeah,
failing.
that's right. Yeah.
That is the problem.
They went from a situation where basically they had to prove intent to establish discrimination to one where, I guess to make it easier to sort of find the people who were discriminating, they moved to a position of, well, um, if somebody isn't getting a job or enough people aren't getting jobs across the whole population, then there must be discrimination.
Well, I think with the case that actually established disparate impact theory was not so much about people not getting jobs. It was about facially neutral requirements that had disparate effects. So like so if I'm a company and I say I'm going to require everyone to take this test, and that test has dramatically different pass rates in the Griggs versus Duke Power case, has dramatically different pass rates for blacks and whites. This was at a time when high school graduation rates were wildly different, for reasons that we know about segregation and school funding, et cetera. And it said that the facially neutral practice of that requirement was the fact that it created disparate outcomes made it a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And so that that was the equation that happened, and from there you get a couple of things. You get the causal claim that inequality is the result of discrimination, right? So this is not what the legal case said. This is the sort of extrapolation that goes from there, and the moral claim that inequality, right? Because what do we think of when we think of discrimination? We don't. It's not a neutral word. We think of discrimination as the expression, particularly as taste-based discrimination. It's the expression of racial animosity.
Well, I mean,
So
there's
if you
definitely
have,
some kind of thing going on that's intentional or at least conscious, right? Because the word
right,
discrimination, I mean, it's from the verb I discriminate, so it
that's
involves
right,
some kind of, well, I
which
mean, the
isn't
implication
right.
is that it's always unfair, but I mean, I guess in the old days it just meant any kind of judgment, really. I mean, that's why also, we use the word prejudice, and I guess the implication there is that the judgment, the judice that you're making, the
Mhm,
judgment is kind of like it's been pre-done because you're seeing someone's skin color, you're seeing someone's sex, rather than looking at
mhm.
content of their
Right,
character or what's in their test results, right?
right,
But
right.
anyway, you said discrimination. Yeah, I
So
agree.
with the
So
case,
originally it was
right.
kind of intentional or conscious, and now it's just like,
Well, what I'm saying is, so there, you could argue about the sort of the etymology of the word discrimination and what it means in different cases, right? That's all. I think that's interesting. That's a separate conversation. What I'm saying is that the way it's used in the Civil Rights Act is that it's obviously referencing taste-based discrimination. So not wanting to hire people because of some racial animus. And that is what when discrimination cases had to be brought under the 14th Amendment, that's what's very hard. And you were saying this before, it's very hard to prove. And so you could imagine, I can't prove this, but logic would suggest that when you have to prove intent in order to successfully bring an anti-discrimination case, when you have to prove intent, there are probably lots of cases of discrimination that don't get brought or that are lost because intent is so hard to prove. Right?
Mm, roughly.
That just makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So that's the problem of requiring intent. When you don't require intent, when you say actually the facially neutral policy that has disparate outcomes can be also a violation of Title VII, can be also a violation of anti-discrimination law. What you're saying is that, okay, you're basically saying instead of a lot of false negatives where discrimination is actually occurring that we can't prove because we can't prove intent, we're going to tolerate the false positives, right? Which is cases where discrimination isn't necessarily occur. It's not the intent,
Yeah.
it's not, so the traditional idea of discrimination that we think of is not necessarily occurring, but because of the facially, and I'm
Yeah.
not saying that was the case with Duke Power. That's a specific, I'm talking more broadly. Um, because of the difficulties with improving intent. It gives, to be clear, like it gives doing that gives a lot more teeth. It gives a lot more power to
Yeah.
anti-discrimination law.
Yeah.
I mean,
Exactly.
it just does.
Yeah.
And
Which
so
was
it's
probably
very
needed in the 60s, but it might have, there were
right.
these unintentional consequences and how far they went, maybe.
I think that and in fact, the legal decision, they even had a carve out, a sort of business necessity carve out, like in the sense that if a company could prove that there was a business necessity case for the facially neutral policy that had
Yeah.
disparate effects, then they could make an exception. But again, like the broader effects, the moral equation of unequal outcomes, unequal impact, and discrimination had no that moral equation.
Yeah.
Not the legal case was narrower. The moral equation had no constraints. Right.
So
Go ahead.
can I just say, so this is quite radical in a sense, because you're saying that this major shift, which you think underpins a lot of what's going on now, and I agree,
Yeah.
it actually happened like decades ago in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So have you read an essay by Richard Hanania called something like "Wokeness is Just Civil Rights Law"?
I have not read it. I mean, I'm familiar enough with his work. I think that my understanding of his argument is that he's a little bit, again, you correct me if I'm wrong, but he is more focused on the legal argument, right? So like, and
Yeah.
less focused. I'm very focused on the moral recoding that happened because of the legal equation.
Yeah, okay.
That's my
I'm just
understanding.
interested in the sort of temporal aspect of it as well, though, because you meet people who are in the sort of broad anti-woke or heterodox movement in universities, and sometimes you get people saying, "Oh, we need to go back to, when left liberalism was reasonable again in 2008," and some people say, "Oh no, we need to go back before the first wave of political correctness in 2000 in the 1990s."
Yeah.
And then, you meet the really sort of extreme people. They'll say, no, we need to go back to the Middle Ages, or someone crazy like me, we need to go back to classical Greece or whatever, right? But but just to be clear, you don't think we should sort of get rid of civil rights law, or that we should go back to the 1950s, right?
No, I'm not prepared to say that at all. I think that what we did is this gets into the work that I do now, the way that I would frame it is sort of at the intersection of, and I'm going backwards to answer your question, is at the intersection of political theory, psychology, and philosophy, right? So political theory because of the way it ties to democracy, psychology because it has to do with our moral judgments, and philosophy because it's really epistemological. It's about what we know, right? And so the political theory part has to do with this is the part we haven't sort of talked about yet. Democracy. One of the things that democracy, where people, there's lots of lots of theorists who have said a lot of things about what democracy requires. One of the things that democracy requires is an understanding that democratically arrived at outcomes. So whether it's a judicial decision, whether it's a policy, whether it's a legislative decision, democratically arrived at outcomes. Democracy is about managing disagreement, right? So I'm not saying anything new there. So those decisions that are arrived at as part of the democratic process are not to be interpreted as having settled the moral or empirical causal questions that lie underneath those decisions, right? We set policy, we make decisions, we make laws without settling the
Yeah.
underlying moral
Right, I
questions.
agree with that.
And
It's a
when
decision-making procedure, right? It
it's
doesn't
a
establish
decision
the,
making,
yeah.
right? And all it means, like if we make a law against, I don't know, I don't know,
Path.
wearing red or something,
Yeah,
whatever. Like
yeah, yeah.
it doesn't mean that all it means is we've made a law. It doesn't mean that it doesn't, it can't be read as some other decision that the people who think that you should wear red are morally abhorrent, et cetera, right? Like
I agree.
this is what democracy requires. When we equated disparate outcomes with inequality, we violated that. That violates, it takes it out of the democratic sphere and it settles the question about is inequality fundamentally unjust?
Right. So you think it's a
And
mistake to have made that sort of quasi, it's
well,
not
I
quite,
think it's a
is it
mistake.
constitutional? I was going to say quasi-constitutional, but I guess there were amendments to the Constitution after civil rights, weren't there?
Oh,
No?
that's a good question.
Or
I
maybe
don't
not.
know.
But anyway, it
I'm not the
basically,
legal scholar enough to know when the last amendment was
well, let
added
me
to
just
the
follow up very quickly
Constitution.
because I know I'll let you go in about 4 minutes. But one thing
Yeah.
that's very interesting theory. One question I have about it, because I've lived in the United States and had a great time, but I've also lived outside the United States, and
Yeah.
these problems are also very real in New Zealand, in Canada, perhaps even bigger in Canada, New Zealand, also in the UK. So just very quickly, I mean, how do you think we get, maybe this isn't your remit, but how do you think we get from the United States civil rights law and then this new mentality in the States to what's happening across the Anglosphere?
Yeah, so let me just back up for a second. I want to be clear that my position is actually not that the case was wrongfully decided. I can understand why the case was decided the way that it was. My point is that we've taken that the democracy can't tolerate the moral recoding that came out of, and because part of the problem with it is that it's all sort of invisible, like none of it gets sort of said explicitly, like, so in other words, well, disparate outcomes are evidence of discrimination, therefore, we have this idea of privilege and we have this idea of structural advantage. It's all sort of very heavily morally encoded and embedded into institutions in a way that has made disagreement, there's no morally legitimate space for disagreement. So I think that part of what needs to happen is you need to bring it back into the space where it can be contested, where all of those claims can be contested. That's a little bit of a different prescription than necessarily overturning the case, right? Like, which I don't know what the right decision is there. I do know that for democracy's purposes, that it needs to be brought back into the sphere of recognizing that those questions are in fact contested, that people of conscience could disagree about them. So how do you get to the international scope? So that's what I would say about that. How do you get to the international scope? Um, it's an interesting question because there is evidence in New Zealand, Australia, the UK, frankly, lots of other countries as well, that similar thinking has. I My sense is it has to do with the way I said this earlier, the way that ideas spread, and also because as countries that were not, my guess is that part of it is that as countries that were not previously immigrant receiving countries that have become immigrant receiving countries in the last 50, 60 years, part of that increasing racial and ethnic diversity probably made the reception to this set of ideas about inequality, about structural advantage, it made it much more applicable, much more relevant than it would have otherwise been. Um,
Yeah,
but it's a
so
good question. That's not really a satisfying answer. I don't really feel satisfied by my
no, I
own
mean, I'm
answer
sort of
there.
guessing myself,
Yeah,
but one thing I thought is just America's so hugely culturally influential that I think the
right,
narrative of civil rights is kind of a holy thing. And I'm actually like, again, I'm sort of behind that myself in general, but we
right.
may have taken
Yeah.
it a bit too far. And then across the Anglosphere, everybody sort of thinks, oh, you're on the wrong side if you wrong
Right.
side of history if you even think that there's a chance that sometimes
Right.
there might
Even
be
that
disparate
idea that the
outcomes for other
history has
reasons
a
than
right and wrong
discrimination.
side is,
Yeah.
yeah, right. I think
I know
it's,
even
yeah,
that
I
idea
mean,
needs to be interrogated, but yeah.
right, right. It needs to be interrogated. I mean, I understand the work it's doing. It just, it needs to be interrogated. So, so yeah, so that's kind of, so that's where we are. And that's what the second book is. It's kind of diving into deeply.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ilana. I should say to my audience that I completely messed up this episode by having various largely avoidable technological snafus, so I apologize to the audience and to Ilana. But look
Well, it
out
was lovely to
for,
be here. Thank you.
yeah, and look out for her next book, which maybe
We don't know the name.
we don't know the name yet, but it'll have your name on it. We know that. So look
It'll
out
have
for
my
Ilana
name on it.
Redstone.
I don't know what it'll be called, but yeah. Well, thank
Okay,
you so much, James.
thanks a lot. Cheers.
Okay, bye.